Now, there are two principal objectives that we have in doing this, and this is what you have to do when you try to put a hypothesis in careful scrutiny. The primary objective of the entire study is to look at the prevalence of CCSVI, and we'll use ultrasound, matching as closely as we possibly can the technique that Professor Zamboni uses in his clinics in Ferrara in Italy. And we'll use MRI along the lines that you've just heard from Mark Hakey, and we'll look at in a cross-section of clinically characterized MS patients, and we'll compare those patients with age and gender matched healthy individuals, so that we'll try and see if we can get the best possible control for a patient who's 55. We'll be able to take someone who is between 52 and 57 within the 5-year matching interval. We also, in a secondary objective, want to quantify, first demonstrate, as we're confident we will do, because Mark's shown you some examples of how you can quantify iron, demonstrate, quantify the deposition of iron in the brain, but also critically in the walls of veins of both the participants and possibly also those who are the healthy individuals. And we're going to try and correlate those iron findings with the clinical status of those who have MS. So the study details are these. Basically, we're going to operate in two phases. The initial phase will be a validation phase where we'll take 10 or 20 participants. Roughly half will be healthy people and half will be MS patients. Now you might ask, why would you want to do an early phase? Well, critically, we want to be absolutely certain that we can make the measurements of ultrasound and the measurements of MR in exactly the same way, so that when we start the second phase of the study, which will have 200 participants, we'll be able to do exactly the same thing across all 200 participants in the full knowledge that we're able to properly assess, having gone through this initial validation phase. The participant recruitment will all come from McMaster's MS clinic, which is where Dr. Paulseth has his offices and his clinics. We have radiologists and scientific personnel, and none of these people will actually know the identity or the clinical status of participants. And in a clinical context, we call these blinding procedures, so that the individuals cannot be biased in their reading of the observations. If they think that they're looking at an MS patient, they can think it, but they will not know for certain that that is the case. That is something which is critical in any rigorous scientific study. The study center is going to be St. Joseph's Hospital. The MR will be in the Imaging Research Center, which has a dedicated research MR machine. And the ultrasound will be done in the Diagnostic Imaging Facility at St. Joe's. For those of you who've never seen an MR, although I suspect most of you in this room have, this is the MR machine. It looks a little bit frightening at first when you're pushed into that hole. But this is a massive magnet, which is something approximately 60,000 times the gravitational pull of the Earth. So it's a very, very powerful magnet that allows you to generate the kinds of pictures that Mark was showing you just a few minutes ago. That's in the Imaging Research Center. As I say, this is a machine dedicated for research purposes. And the ultrasound will be done in the brand new facility, which has been only open for about a year now, in the new Diagnostic Imaging Facility at St. Joe's, which has all the state-of-the-art machinery that you need to be able to look at ultrasound and, if you need to, other sorts of images. So what about the details of the participants who will be in this study? Well, again, for reasons which are part of the rigor of scientific control, the patients and the participants will be randomly selected. There'll be 100 MS subjects broken into 4 groups, which have been described for you earlier this afternoon by Dr. Paulseth. Primary progressive, secondary progressive, relapsing remitting, and this latter group, which is the benign MS group. There'll be 100 healthy control subjects, again 4 groups of 25 in each group, to match up with each of these 4 groups. As I said before, age and gender matched, and we're recruiting and we'll be randomizing patients between the ages of 18 and 65 years. You might like to know what the study timelines are. I think it's important that you should. Our anticipated starting date for this validation phase is in July of this year. The Research Ethics Board, which is a necessary authority within the hospital, has been reviewing the submission that we've made. They sat in judgment on that submission on Monday of this past week, and we'll know the full outcome very shortly. in order to be able to use any human being in any sort of experimental setting, you must have approval from your ethics board. We're not allowed to use you as guinea pigs as we might wish to. We're under very, very careful scrutiny by research ethics, and one cannot stress enough how important the work of that group is. Now, we don't anticipate that they'll say no. That would be the most devastating part of my entire career. As a Scotsman, I don't usually bet unless it's with somebody else's money. But I'd be prepared to put a small wager on the fact that we will get research ethics approval. As I say, starting in July with the validation study, do it as quickly as we can, start the major phase of the study in August 2010. If we have the resources to be able to push this forward, then we'd anticipate that the study phase would be completed by the first quarter of next year, perhaps as early as the early part of next year. And we'd love to talk about the results somewhere around about this time next year. So that from start to finish, if we are vigorous, as we are passionate about pursuing this study, then the anticipation is within a year we're going to have the data that will allow us to talk about CCSVI in this very controlled setting. So you might say, well, are you going to stop there? And the answer is certainly not. We believe that if there is the data to justify it from this first study, then we'd want to go on and start considering a randomized controlled clinical trial for surgical intervention. So we've already started thinking about the feasibility, about the possibility of developing a protocol, how we generate project support to be able to do this, and we're looking to have a readiness to commence when the data from the current study is available to us and if it justifies such a study. Now you might think, why are you jumping the gun? You haven't even started study number 1 and you're thinking about study number 2. Now many of you are really interested in this particular type of study, the intervention study. Well, the reason we're starting to think about it now, and we already are, because we've already had, and I've already had conversations with Dr. David Sackett, who is essentially the guru of evidence-based medicine for randomized controlled clinical trials coming out of McMaster. We've already had these discussions because he's persuaded us that we need to start now, because sometimes these protocols take a year or more to develop. So there's no point in waiting until we have the data. We need to think about, if the data justifies going ahead, the minute we finish the first study, can we be ready to start the second one? And so that is something that we've started, albeit that is going to take quite a lengthy period for us to get through. All the time we're doing this, we'll be running the first study so we can answer the questions in relation to CCSVI. So I hope in this last few minutes I've given you some idea of what we're intending, the rigor that we're attaching to the study, the speed that we believe is important to be able to generate the information, and that we're looking at this as the beginnings of something which will go further.